Is what's happening right now in the Middle East prophetic? Did the Bible predict it? Is it the Gog and Magog battle of Ezekiel 38? Is it the Psalm 83 war? Or is it something else entirely? This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and we have received dozens, if not hundreds of questions regarding this. Where should we look in the Bible to find out what's going on and where this is leading? This, of course, is why you follow this channel, because there are a lot of ideas right now floating around on the internet about the current struggle that Israel's involved in, but you want an accurate biblical assessment. And we're glad you trust us. The number one theory out there right now is that this is the beginning of the Gog and Magog struggle in Ezekiel 38. I've heard this from a dozen prominent prophecy teachers. Now, ultimately, Gog and Magog will happen. But is this it? Let's read a portion of what takes place before the Gog and Magog invasion. In the latter years, and we could agree that we're there, God is talking to Gog, will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual place of ruin, but its people were brought out from the nations. So that certainly is the restoration of Israel in 1948. But let's keep reading. And they are living securely. All of them. Is that true now? Are all the people of Israel living securely? No, it's not true. But before the Gog-Magog battle, they will have been living securely. Let's keep reading. You, and again this is speaking of Gog, will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, who live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates. Ezekiel 38:11. Is this true? Is Israel living without walls, bars, or gates? No, quite the opposite. Israel is one of the most fortified countries in the world. Again, for the Gog of Magog battle to take place, most of these walls, bars, and gates must be taken down, or at least not manned. It has to be much less defended than it is today. In Ezekiel 38, we are told that Israel is a nation of unwalled villages living at peace before the invasion from the north. So these conditions must be met for Ezekiel 38 to begin to happen. So if you're listening to your favorite scholar and they're saying, Russia is organizing Gog and Magog right now, don't believe it. Israel and the surrounding nations are not getting ready for Ezekiel 38 just yet. But the current struggle that we hear on the news every night might be what sets up Ezekiel 38 and the Gog of Magog battle, because some major things have to happen first. Maybe what we're watching is making that get ready to happen. Now, Israel has to be at peace, and that is, of course, a big change from the current situation. So that is the position of his channel on Ezekiel 38 and Gog of Magog, that what's happening is not Ezekiel 38, but it well could be setting up Ezekiel 38 by making Israel a land of unwalled villages. Is there a prophecy that might seem to indicate how this happens? Well, Psalm 83 is often brought up also as a possible prophecy. Psalm 83 indicates an inner ring of peoples, not necessarily nations, that surround Israel. But interestingly, not one of the people groups in Psalm 83 are those listed in Ezekiel 38. The ones that attack Israel in the Gog of Magog battle. The two passages are mutually exclusive groups. Not one people group from Psalm 83 is found in Ezekiel 38. Not one nation in Ezekiel 38 is found in Psalm 83. Now, there's several theories out there on why that is, but none of them really made complete sense to us. But keep watching, because we're pretty sure we have figured out why that is, and we'd love to share that with you. We believe this is the first time this theory will be presented anywhere on the internet. So, there's an inner ring of Psalm 83 nations, people groups, and an outer ring of Ezekiel 38. As we said, why is this? Let's look at what a couple scholars say. Bill Salas, who has written a book about Psalm 83 that I've read, says Israel utterly defeats these inner nations that are part of this inner ring prior to the Gog of Magog war. And that's why the people groups are separate. The inner group no longer exists. They were defeated, according to Salas. Unfortunately, there's a problem with this theory, and that problem is that several of the inner ring nations are specifically mentioned in Armageddon passages found in Joel 3, Isaiah 11. So either they're totally defeated, but then rise back up to join the Ezekiel 38 nations later on, or they existed all the time and are just not mentioned. Now, Joel Richardson is a scholar who believes they were always part of the Ezekiel 38 alliance. But why aren't they listed? Well, maybe they are. In Ezekiel 38:6, the text says, "And many nations with you," which implies there are more nations than just the ones listed. It was suggested that perhaps the nations listed are the leader nations, and the Psalm 83 nations are just follower nations, and that's why they're not listed. It's a theory. A better theory, however, in my mind, and one this channel has developed, is the Psalm 83 groups of peoples are those that have always been at war with Israel since their formation as a nation back in 1948. And all of the various wars in Israel since then have involved these Psalm 83 nations. The ones that haven't been involved yet are the Ezekiel 38 nations: Turkey, Iran, Sudan, Libya. Ezekiel 38 mentions these by name because they haven't been involved in attacking Israel yet. But in that Gog of Magog war, they joined forces with the Psalm 83 peoples who have been repeatedly attacking Israel to create an overwhelming army. Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38 coming together. The Bible also mentions these additional nations in Ezekiel 38 because their leader, Gog, comes from Magog, one of these additional nations. Okay, let's test out this new theory by looking at the people groups in Psalm 83. Here is a listing of the people from that psalm: the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites. Edom is southern Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia, and the Ishmaelites are Saudi Arabia. Moab and the Hagarites. Moab is Jordan. The Hagarites are Egypt, descendants of Hagar. Gebal, Ammon, and Amalek. Gebal is part of Lebanon. Ammon is Jordan. Ammon, Jordan happens to be the capital of Jordan. Amalek is southern Israel itself and perhaps the West Bank. Philistia, or the Philistines, and that's Gaza. Tyre, which is Lebanon, and Assyria has also joined them. Psalm 83, 6-8. And Assyria could be considered modern Syria and possibly parts of Iraq. So, listing these nations that we've just mentioned together, we have Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank. These are the nations that surround Israel, the nations round about, as the Bible calls them. Now, let's look at the nations that have taken part in each of Israel's wars that have stretched from 1948 to the present. You're going to be shocked at two things. One, how many times Israel has been at war. And second, how the nations in Psalm 83 exactly match the people who took part in these wars. 1948, All the nations that we just listed took part in the war, except Gaza and the West Bank. So Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Lebanon all were part of that war. The 1956 war, Egypt fought. In the 1967 war, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan all fought. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt and Syria fought in the war. In the Intifada terrorist war, Gaza and the West Bank fought. In 2006, it was Lebanon fighting. 2008, Gaza fought in that war. And now in 2023, so far, Gaza is the one fighting, and Lebanon has at least been firing missiles. So although there's never been a single war where all the inner ring nations of Psalm 83 fought together, all these nations have, at one time or another, fought wars against Israel. So there's your answer to the meaning of Psalm 83. They are what the Bible calls the nations round about Israel. And this psalm is prophetic of all the wars that have taken place from 1948 to the present, and we think these nations are going to be part of the Gog of Magog struggle as well. Let's look at some of the passages we referred to before. How about Joel 3? What are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? So there's Gaza and there's Lebanon. And Jesus is addressing them at the sheep and goat judgment after his return. So they're there at the final end. We see the same kind of thing in Isaiah 11. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, that's an inner ring nation, from Egypt, inner ring also, from Pathros, from Cush, that's Ezekiel 38 nation, from Elam, that's Iran, Ezekiel 38, from Shinar, that's Iran, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea, which is Lebanon and Gaza. So all these nations are mixed at the return of Jesus. But as of today, none of the Ezekiel 38 nations have participated in any of these wars that have taken place. So it looks like our theory holds up really well. Ezekiel 38 adds nations to the list already established in Psalm 83. And these nations will be added when and only when Israel is existing in security in a land of unwalled villages. Now, this doesn't mean Israel will tear all the walls down. Ezekiel 38:20 says Israel's walls fall when Gog invades. But it means Israel isn't relying on them for security. So how is Israel going to reach that state of affairs? Most likely by means of the Antichrist peace covenant. It will likely establish a false peace and make Israel feel secure. As we indicated in this previous video, it may even involve a UN peacekeeping force occupying Gaza, Lebanon, and perhaps even Israel itself. Imagine how secure Israel would feel if there was a UN peacekeeping force keeping Gaza from doing anything nefarious. In Lebanon, same thing. And peacekeepers right on the streets of Israel, keeping the streets safe. They would feel secure. This covenant then would launch the 70th week of Daniel. And around the midpoint, however, of the 70th week, that covenant would be broken. The Gog and Magog invasion will begin, and it will include the Ezekiel 38 nations and the Psalm 83 nations. Now, Psalm 83 nations that won't participate in the Gog of Magog invasion are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which is also located on the Arabian Peninsula, by the way. We know that because of Ezekiel 38:13. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, have you come to see spoil? Sheba is likely the UAE, and Dedan is Saudi Arabia, while the merchants of Tarshish are the Western nations, Europe and maybe the USA. So these nations aren't included in the Ezekiel 38 invasion. Both UAE and Saudis are likely going to be in an Abraham Accord relationship with Israel at that point. Notice they question Gog about his motives, so they aren't a direct part of this invasion, this first part of the invasion. Later, when Gog the Antichrist is in charge of the whole world, they will join him at Armageddon because all the nations join against Israel. So that brings us back around to whether the current struggle that's going on now is prophetic. And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. It's prophetic in that it is part of the Psalm 83 group of wars. Just happens to be the 8th in the series of these wars. Do we gain any special information about what happens? Who wins? Does Hezbollah join the conflict, etc., etc.? Unfortunately, we don't learn any of this from Psalm 83. We get no information like that. What we do know is that Israel is going to still exist after the current war, and they're going to end up living in a state of security, which we think happens when the Antichrist peace covenant is enacted. We also see that Saudi Arabia seems to move from being aligned with the Psalm 83 nations to eventually being more aligned with Israel. So, when is this Antichrist peace covenant going to take place? Click right here to discover that we expect it to happen in less than a year. And who is it that brokers the peace? Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.